The city did not fall in a single moment. It eroded quietly at first, through decisions that seemed small, reversible, even rational. By the time the walls of Baghdad finally faced the horizon filled with Mongol banners, the collapse had already begun months earlier, in rooms far removed from the battlefield. Baghdad in the mid-13th century was no ordinary city. It was not merely a political capital. It was a symbol. For 5 centuries, it had stood as the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, a center of scholarship, theology, and authority that extended far beyond its physical walls. Even as real political power had fragmented across competing sultanates and dynasties, Baghdad retained something more difficult to measure: legitimacy. But legitimacy, unlike armies, cannot stop an invasion. By 1258, the Islamic world was already fractured. Regional rulers operated with increasing independence. Military strength had decentralized. Loyalty was conditional. And perhaps most critically, the illusion of unity persisted long after its substance had disappeared. At the center of this fragile structure stood Caliph al-Musta'lim. He was not an incompetent ruler in the simplistic sense often portrayed in later narratives, but he governed within assumptions that no longer matched the reality forming beyond his borders. His court remained steeped in ceremonial authority, guided by advisors who often underestimated threats they did not fully understand. And to the east, a force was advancing that did not operate within those assumptions at all. The Mongols. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire had already demonstrated a pattern that was both consistent and terrifying. Cities that submitted were often spared. Cities that resisted were systematically destroyed, not out of chaos, but through deliberate policy designed to eliminate future resistance. This was not simply warfare. It was enforcement. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, had been tasked with extending Mongol authority deeper into the Islamic world. His campaign was not improvised. It was methodical, supported by engineers, siege specialists, and logistical systems refined over decades of expansion. Before Baghdad, there had already been warnings. Entire regions had collapsed under similar pressure. Fortified cities, some believed to be impregnable, had fallen after brief resistance. The Mongols did not rely solely on brute force. They studied terrain, exploited political divisions, and applied overwhelming pressure at decisive points. Their strength was not just in numbers but in coordination. As Hulagu moved westward, he issued a message to Baghdad: submit, acknowledge Mongol supremacy, and avoid destruction. It was a calculated offer. For the Mongols, submission without battle preserved resources and secured territory efficiently. But refusal, especially from a city as symbolically significant as Baghdad, required a different response. Inside the caliphal court, the message was received, discussed, and ultimately dismissed. The reasons were complex. Some advisors believed the Mongol threat was exaggerated. Others assumed that the city's historical prestige would deter a full-scale assault. There were also expectations, unfulfilled, that other Muslim powers would rally to Baghdad's defense if a siege began. But these assumptions rested on a strategic reality that no longer existed. No unified army was coming, no coalition was forming, and the Mongols understood this. Hulagu did not rush toward Baghdad in a reckless advance. His approach was deliberate. Supply lines were secured. Regional resistance was neutralized. Potential allies of Baghdad were either intimidated into neutrality or eliminated before they could intervene. This isolation was not accidental, it was engineered. As the Mongol forces advanced, they carried with them not only soldiers, but a reputation. News of prior destructions traveled faster than the army itself. Cities along the path faced a choice that was no longer abstract. Submit or disappear. Some chose submission. Others resisted and were erased. Baghdad watched these developments from a distance that felt deceptively safe. Reports arrived, but they were filtered through layers of interpretation, optimism, and disbelief. The scale of Mongol capability was difficult to grasp for those who had not yet witnessed it directly. Meanwhile, inside the city, preparation remained limited. Baghdad's defenses, while historically formidable, had not been modernized to match the evolving realities of siege warfare. Its walls were strong, but static. Its military forces were significant on paper, but coordination and readiness were inconsistent. Numbers alone do not determine outcomes. Discipline, command structure, and clarity of response matter more when pressure arrives suddenly. And pressure was coming. Beyond the political miscalculations, there was also a deeper structural weakness. The Abbasid Caliphate had, over generations, transitioned from a centralized military power into a more symbolic authority. Real military strength often lay in the hands of regional commanders, whose loyalty could not always be guaranteed. In times of stability, this fragmentation could be managed. In times of invasion, it became a liability. As Hulagu's army closed the distance, the strategic situation narrowed. There were fewer options, less time, and increasing urgency. Yet the decisions within Baghdad did not accelerate at the same pace. This mismatch between external threat and internal response would prove decisive. The Mongols, by contrast, operated with clarity. Their objectives were defined. Their chain of command was unified. Their tactics had been tested across multiple campaigns against diverse enemies. They adapted quickly, but they did not hesitate. Hulagu's campaign toward Baghdad was not merely about conquest. It was about demonstration. A city that symbolized authority would be confronted by a force that redefined it. By late 1257, the final phase of the approach had begun. Mongol units advanced in coordinated movements, securing key routes and cutting off potential lines of reinforcement. Reconnaissance units mapped the terrain surrounding Baghdad, identifying weak points, river crossings, and optimal positions for siege operations. This was preparation, not improvisation. Inside the city, tension began to rise, but not uniformly. Some recognized the severity of the situation. Others continued to believe that a negotiated outcome remained possible, even as evidence suggested otherwise. The Caliph faced a narrowing set of choices. Submission would preserve the city, but at the cost of sovereignty and prestige. Resistance would uphold symbolic authority, but risk total destruction. This was not a purely military decision, it was psychological. To submit would be to acknowledge a new order, one in which Baghdad was no longer the center. To resist was to defend an identity that had already begun to fracture beneath the surface. In this moment, hesitation carried its own consequences. Time, once an abstract resource, became a strategic liability. As the Mongol army established its forward positions, the scale of the threat became impossible to ignore. This was not a raid, not a probing attack, not a force that could be repelled with limited engagement. It was an organized, deliberate encirclement in progress. Still, the final decision leaned toward resistance, whether driven by miscalculation, pride, or a belief that the Mongols could be delayed or negotiated with under pressure. Baghdad did not fully commit to submission, and once that line was crossed, the nature of the conflict changed. For the Mongols, resistance eliminated ambiguity. The campaign would proceed according to a pattern already established elsewhere. Systematic, uncompromising. As the first elements of the Mongol siege infrastructure began to take shape beyond the city's perimeter, Baghdad entered a phase it had not experienced in centuries: isolation. Not just physically, but strategically. The outer world, once a network of potential support, had receded. What remained was the city itself, its walls, its defenders, its ERASED, a force now to confront a reality they had delayed acknowledging. The siege had not yet begun in full force, but the outcome was already being shaped by decisions made long before the first projectile would strike the walls. And beyond the horizon, the Mongol army continued its silent, methodical advance, closing the distance, not just to the city, but to the moment where hesitation would no longer be possible. By January 1258, the distance between anticipation and contact had disappeared. The Mongol army did not arrive at Baghdad as a single advancing mass. It unfolded, deliberately, across the landscape, dividing into coordinated elements that moved with a clarity of purpose refined through decades of campaigning. Hulagu Khan's force was not defined by sheer size alone, but by composition. At its core were Mongol cavalry units, highly disciplined, mobile, and accustomed to operating independently while remaining synchronized within a broader strategy. But this was not a purely nomadic army. Accompanying them were engineers from across the empire, including Chinese and Persian specialists experienced in siegecraft. These men carried with them the knowledge required to dismantle cities that had once relied on walls for survival. Baghdad's defenders, by contrast, represented a different kind of military structure. The Caliph's army was numerically large, tens of thousands when fully assembled, but cohesion was uneven. Units varied in training, equipment, and command hierarchy. Some were experienced soldiers, others had been hastily mobilized, their readiness shaped more by obligation than preparation. Numbers created an impression of strength, but impressions do not coordinate movement under pressure. The terrain surrounding Baghdad shaped the engagement before the first direct clash occurred. The city sat along the Tigris River, its defenses partially anchored by water barriers that had historically provided both protection and logistical advantage. Canals, embankments, and cultivated lands extended outward, creating a complex environment that could either hinder or assist an approaching army, depending on who controlled it. Hulagu understood this immediately. Rather than rushing the walls, the Mongols began by controlling the environment around them. Units moved to secure river crossings upstream and downstream, effectively isolating Baghdad from external movement. Detachments cut communication routes, ensuring that no reinforcements or escape would disrupt the encirclement. The objective was not just to surround the city, but to control the conditions under which the siege would unfold. This was operational containment. Inside Baghdad, the scale of the encirclement began to take form through observation rather than reports. Dust rising on the horizon, distant formations moving with precision, outposts disappearing one by one. These were the first indicators that the city was no longer operating within a defensive buffer. The battlefield had expanded beyond the walls. In response, the Caliph's commanders attempted limited engagements outside the city. These were not full-scale offensives, but probing movements, efforts to disrupt Mongol positioning before the siege could fully solidify. Yet these attempts revealed a critical imbalance. Mongol units did not react impulsively. They absorbed pressure, withdrew when necessary, and countered with speed that exposed gaps in coordination. What appeared to be retreats often became traps, drawing Baghdad's forces into positions where they could be isolated and struck from multiple directions. This was a familiar pattern. Feigned withdrawal had been a Mongol tactic for generations, but against an opponent lacking unified command, its effectiveness increased. Small losses compounded into larger ones, not through decisive battles, but through repeated miscalculations. Each failed sortie reduced Baghdad's capacity to influence the space beyond its walls. And with every withdrawal, the Mongols tightened their control. Within days, the outer environment belonged entirely to Hulagu. The siege phase began not with a single signal, but through a series of coordinated preparations. Siege engines were assembled at measured distances, far enough to remain protected, close enough to deliver sustained pressure. Earthworks were constructed to shield advancing units. Defensive lines were established to prevent any breakout attempt. This was not chaos. It was engineering applied to warfare. From the walls of Baghdad, these preparations would have been visible in fragment structures rising where open ground had existed, movement that did not disperse but accumulated. The realization that the Mongols intended a full siege, rather than a raid or demonstration, became unavoidable. Inside the city, the psychological shift began. Uncertainty gave way to recognition to tension, but tension does not produce coordination automatically. Command decisions within Baghdad remained reactive. Defensive positions were reinforced, but without a unified plan for counteraction. Supplies were accounted for, though not always efficiently distributed. Communication between units depended heavily on individual initiative rather than structured command channels. Under normal conditions, such weaknesses could remain hidden. Under siege, they became visible. The Mongols, meanwhile, advanced their preparations without interruption. Catapults capable of launching heavy projectiles over long distances were positioned strategically to target key sections of the walls. These were not indiscriminate attacks. Engineers identified structural vulnerabilities, aiming to create breaches where defenses could not easily compensate. At the same time, archers and cavalry units maintained constant pressure on the perimeter, ensuring that defenders could not operate freely along the walls. This created a layered form of engagement. No single point of contact defined the battle. Instead, pressure was distributed, forcing Baghdad's defenders to respond across multiple fronts simultaneously. Fatigue became a factor early. Not just physical fatigue, but cognitive strain. Defenders were required to remain alert across extended sections of the wall, uncertain where the primary assault would emerge. Every movement beyond the walls carried potential threat. Every impact from a siege engine signaled that time was working against them. The river, once a source of advantage, became contested space. Mongol units secured positions along the Tigris, limiting the city's ability to use it for resupply or maneuver. Control of water routes allowed Hulagu to reinforce his own positions while denying the same flexibility to Baghdad. This was not merely encirclement, it was restriction of options. As the first sustained bombardments began, the nature of the conflict shifted again. Sound replaced speculation, the impact of stone against fortification, the collapse of outer structures, the visible damage accumulating across sections of the wall. These were signals that could not be reinterpreted or dismissed. The siege was now active. Inside Baghdad, responses became more urgent. Repair efforts were initiated where damage occurred, but resources were limited. Each section of wall required manpower to maintain. Each breach required immediate attention. The distribution of defenders became a balancing act, reinforced too heavily in one area, and another became vulnerable. This created fragmentation. The Mongols, observing these adjustments, adapted accordingly. When defenders concentrated in one sector, pressure increased elsewhere. When repairs slowed in another, bombardment intensified. The objective was not simply to break the walls, but to exhaust the system maintaining them. This was attrition applied with precision. Commanders within Baghdad faced a narrowing set of choices. To conserve forces risked allowing breaches to expand unchecked. To commit aggressively risked overextension in a battle where the enemy dictated tempo, and tempo, more than numbers, defined control. Hulagu maintained that control by avoiding unnecessary risks. Direct assaults were delayed until conditions favored them. Losses were minimized not through hesitation, but through timing. Every phase of the siege was designed to weaken the city before committing to decisive engagement. Days passed under constant pressure. For the defenders, time no longer functioned as preparation, but as erosion. Morale, though difficult to measure, began to shift. Initial confidence gave way to sustained anxiety. Reports of damage, casualties, and failed counteractions accumulated. The expectation of relief, once a possibility, faded with each passing day that no external force appeared. Isolation became reality. Within the walls, the understanding grew that the outcome would be determined not by external intervention, but by what remained inside the city. And outside, the Mongol army continued its work with consistency that allowed no pause. By early February, sections of Baghdad's defenses showed visible strain. Not yet collapse, but weakening. The pattern had been established. Pressure applied. Response forced. Resources consumed. Options reduced. The final phase of engagement was approaching, not as a sudden escalation, but as the inevitable result of a system pushed beyond its capacity to sustain itself. And when that moment arrived, the battle would no longer be about holding the walls. It would be about what happened when they could no longer be held at all. The collapse did not begin with a single breach. It began when the system holding the defense together could no longer respond fast enough. By early February 1258, the walls of Baghdad still stood, but they no longer functioned as a unified barrier. Sections had been weakened, repaired, weakened again. Defenders moved constantly along the perimeter, but movement itself had become a symptom of instability rather than control. Hulagu Khan did not need to guess where the breaking point would emerge. The pattern had already revealed it. Sustained bombardment had concentrated along key sectors where the structure of the wall, combined with terrain conditions, made reinforcement more difficult. These areas had absorbed repeated impact, and although temporary repairs held them in place, the underlying integrity had been compromised. The Mongols adjusted accordingly. Siege engines intensified their fire in these sectors, not continuously, but rhythmically, allowing moments of reduced pressure that encouraged repair efforts, only to follow with renewed impact that undid them. This was not random destruction. It was controlled exhaustion. Inside the city, defenders faced a narrowing reality. Every repair required time, manpower, and coordination. But time was no longer sufficient. Manpower was diminishing, and coordination, already strained, began to fragment under the cumulative weight of constant response. Then, the first true breach opened, not a collapse of the entire wall, but a section that could no longer be restored quickly enough to maintain continuity. It created an entry point, not yet large enough for full assault, but sufficient to alter the dynamics of the siege. The meaning of the war had changed. Until that moment, it had defined separation inside and outside, defender and attacker. With the breach, that separation became conditional. Hulagu did not order an immediate full-scale assault. Instead, he tested the opening. Forward units advanced cautiously, probing the response. Archers provided cover. Engineers assessed whether the breach could be widened without exposing assault forces to concentrated counterattack. This restraint reflected a consistent pattern. The Mongols did not rush into uncertain conditions. They shaped them until uncertainty diminished. Inside Baghdad, the breach triggered urgency that bordered on panic. Commanders redirected forces to contain the opening, pulling defenders from other sections of the wall. This created imbalances elsewhere, gaps that required further redistribution. The defensive system, already under strain, began to lose coherence. Decisions were no longer proactive. They were reactions to immediate threats. And reactions, by nature, arrive after initiative has already shifted. The Mongols expanded the breach. Repeated bombardment widened the opening, while advancing units secured positions just beyond the wall. These footholds allowed them to apply pressure inward, forcing defenders to engage not just at the boundary, but within contested space. The battle had entered a new phase. No longer defined by siege alone, it became a layered conflict. Part defense, part urban engagement, part psychological collapse. Within the city, lines of defense were reformed behind the breach, but these were improvised. Streets, buildings, and narrow passages offered opportunities for resistance, but also created confusion. Visibility was limited. Command signals struggled to reach all units. Coordination deteriorated further. The defenders were no longer operating as a unified force. They were fragments attempting to stabilize a situation that was already shifting beyond their control. Hulagu recognized this transition immediately. The order for broader assault followed, not as a sudden escalation, but as the logical next step in a process that had been unfolding since the siege began. Mongol units advanced through multiple points, some through established breaches, others along weakened sections of the wall where resistance had thinned. The objective was not to concentrate in a single area, but to diffuse pressure across the city's defensive interior. This created disorientation. Defenders could not predict where the primary thrust would emerge. Every direction carried threat. Every attempt to consolidate forces risked exposing another sector. Urban warfare magnified these effects. Unlike open battlefields, the city restricted movement and line of sight. Units became isolated. Orders were delayed or misinterpreted. Small engagements multiplied into a continuous, fragmented conflict where no single commander could maintain full awareness of the situation. Fatigue deepened, not just from physical exertion, but from sustained uncertainty. Defenders faced an enemy that did not pause, did not disengage, and did not present a single point of focus. The Mongols, by contrast, maintained structure within this complexity. Their units operated with defined objectives, supported by communication methods adapted to fragmented environments. Signals, visual and auditory, allowed coordination, even when direct visibility was limited. This preserved cohesion where the defenders lost it. As pressure increased, resistance began to collapse in sections. Not all at once. Some areas held longer, organized around local leadership or favorable terrain. Others disintegrated quickly, their defenders either overwhelmed or unable to reposition effectively. The pattern repeated. Localized resistance, encirclement, elimination, then movement forward. The city, once a continuous defensive entity, became a series of isolated zones, each facing the same outcome at different intervals. At this stage, the decision to resist had fully transformed into consequence. Caliph al-Mustar, confronted with the scale of collapse, moved toward negotiation, but the conditions had changed. Earlier, submission might have preserved the city. Now, after resistance had been sustained, after Mongol forces had committed resources and absorbed losses, the framework of response shifted. For the Mongols, this was no longer a negotiation between equals or even between adversaries. It was enforcement following defiance. The city's defenses, both physical and organizational, ceased to function as a coordinated system. Remaining resistance became sporadic, unconnected, and increasingly symbolic rather than strategic. Baghdad had fallen not at a single moment, but through the cumulative breakdown of its ability to resist. What followed was not a continuation of battle, but its aftermath. The Mongol approach to cities that resisted had been demonstrated before. Baghdad, despite its historical significance, was not exempt.